Okay. So yesterday, Joe Biden was inaugurated as the new US president. Will everything be all right now?
Biden was elected. It's a relief to have Trump and his associates out of the executive branch. They're not gone. Uh, Biden's first steps have been heartening, but there are many problems to be faced. For one thing, his own programs are not sufficient, anywhere near sufficient, to deal
Why
with
are
the
they not
kind of
sufficient?
pardon?
Excuse me, what is not sufficient about his
Well,
program?
let's take the two most important problems we face. These are problems of survival of the species, basically. If these problems aren't dealt with, nothing else matters, and they have to be dealt with soon. One is the growing threat of nuclear war. The other is environmental catastrophe.
Mhm.
As far as the threat of nuclear war is concerned, it's increased severely in the last couple of years. That's why the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has moved closer to midnight
Why,
every year.
why did why did the danger of a nuclear war get more severe in the last
Why?
years?
Well, there was an arms control regime which had been laboriously put together over almost 60 years. Trump dismantled it. It's gone. It didn't end the threat of nuclear war, it somewhat mitigated the threat. That's gone. This is combined with the initiatives to develop new and far more dangerous uh, uh, nuclear weapon systems and other systems. Put those two together, greatly increases the threat of nuclear war. Also combined with provocative actions in many parts of the world, which increase the threat of war.
But
So the tensions in the Middle East are extended by the series of attacks against Iran, sometimes ranging from assassination and sabotage, cyber war, to crushing, crippling sanctions, none of which are justified. That's the threat of nuclear war.
now that Trump is not in control of the codes for the US nuclear weapons, did the world become a safer place?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Now that Trump is not in control of the US nuclear weapons anymore, did this world become a safer place?
We don't know. I think it probably does because he was very unpredictable. And it could have been possible for him to suddenly, in a fit of, you know, psychotic fit, say, okay, I'll do it. I think now we expect things to be more normal. I'm sure the top military command is much relieved that things are more predictable. But
Mhm,
that's not the real issue.
mhm.
The issue was the steps that were taken step by step during the Trump administration to increase the threat. That's the reason why the doomsday clock moved forward towards termination every year that Trump was in office. Last January, they abandoned minutes altogether, moved to seconds, 100 seconds to midnight, which means termination. Now, it wasn't just the nuclear threat, it's also the failure to deal with the growing environmental crisis. And here, too, the Trump administration was unique in the world,
Mhm. What's your
except for some
what's your verdict of the Trump administration after 4 years?
after.
After 4 years of Trump, what's your verdict on that administration?
It's been the most dangerous administration in world history. There is no one, no other political figure in history who has dedicated his major efforts to trying to destroy the prospects of human life on Earth.
Let me
That's
give
new.
you if you compare that, if you say the most dangerous in world history, what about Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany?
Horrible, that maybe the lowest that humans have ever sunk. But did Hitler work to try to destroy the prospects for human life on Earth? Trump did.
Mhm, mhm.
We may not like to think about it, but he did.
Do you
He
think,
worked very hard to maximize the use of fossil fuels and to eliminate the regulations that somewhat mitigated their effects. This is a race to disaster, and they knew what they were doing. So one of the Trump bureaucracies, National Transportation Administration, actually did a very careful environmental study, an analysis of where we're heading on our current course. They determined that by the end of this century, on our current course, we would reach 4 degrees centigrade, 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Every scientific and sane source knows that's total cataclysm. Then they made a recommendation. Let's race faster. Let's eliminate controls on auto emissions so we can race faster. Meanwhile, Trump was saying, let's increase the use of fossil fuels, open new areas for exploration, use the worst, most polluting ones like coal, eliminate restrictions on pollution. This is insanity. There's
but,
been
but, it
nothing
was,
like this in history.
but it was not the aim of Trump to eliminate the human race. He maybe accepted it as side effects of his politics. Or do you think it was his aim to destroy the human race?
I don't think he cared. I mean, he knew it was happening. We know the actions. We only have a short period of time to deal with this. Spending 4 years accelerating the crisis is is a crime of the kind that has never happened before. Never.
So,
Try to find an analog. May
um,
sound outrageous, but think it through.
mhm,
Has there ever been a time when some political figure devoted his major energies to trying to accelerate the race to species destruction in the near future? Can't think of any.
mhm, mhm.
Not Genghis Khan, not Attila the Hun, nobody I can think of.
Okay.
This is unique.
You call the Republicans, for that reason, the most dangerous organization in human history. Do you think that the party will be able to reinvent itself now that Trump is not the president anymore?
Well, the Trump party is now very torn. It's very difficult to be a senator today. You have two powerful forces that are opposed and that you must obey. You must obey them, and they're opposed. One is the voting base, which happens to be mostly controlled by Trump. He carried, even after the January 6th events, his support in the voting base increased. His support at the local levels increased. The Republican National Congress welcomed him after the January 6th events. That part of the party, for the moment at least, he controls. Then there's the other part, the donor class, the wealthy, the prime constituency of the Republican Party long before Trump, continuing with Trump. The primary constituency is the very rich and the corporate sector. They didn't like him, but they were willing to tolerate him as long as he was lining their pockets properly. He lavished them with gifts. All the only legislative actions are all to enrich the very powerful and the corporate sector. And they were willing to tolerate his antics as long as he was doing that. January 6th was too much. They basically told him it's over. There was a real impressive power play. National Association of Manufacturers, Chamber of Commerce, leading corporate executives, heads of the financial sector told him, it's finished, you're gone. Very quickly, the Senate started to shift. Republicans started to drift away. This is not only their primary constituency, it's the source of their support. It's their donor base. So here you are, Mitch McConnell. You have to decide, am I going to try to control the voting base, to respond to the voting base, or am I going to respond to the big guns who I serve and who fund me? It's as simple as that. And they're torn. And how the party will deal with this is very unclear. May break up.
And what do you think holds the future for Trump? What do you think are his plans?
I think it's very likely that Trump will set up a kind of an alternative shadow government, maybe in Mar-a-Lago, where he'll depict himself as the legitimate president. He'll be supported by a very large part of the Republican voting base, large part of the local officials, most of which seem to be subordinated to him, the ones less concerned with the donor class than senators are. And they'll probably set this up as an alternative. I suspect he'll be working with Mitch McConnell, who is a genius at making the country ungovernable. Remember McConnell during the 2 years when Obama was in office and had control of Congress. McConnell was the Senate Minority Leader. He said straight out, we have to do everything possible to make sure that Obama fails. That means do everything possible to make the country ungovernable, do as much harm as you can, blame it on the Democrats with some justice, then come back into power. I don't see any reason to doubt that he'll do the same thing now. Let's make the country ungovernable. Let's block every proposal. Let's harm the country as much as possible. There'll be failures. We can blame it on the administration. We can come roaring back with the cooperation of the voting base that's in the hands of Trump, which he may decide to lead. This is a bad dream, but it's not an impossible nightmare. It's a very possible, not necessary, not certain, but a very possible scenario.
Do you think, in the inauguration speech, Biden said his biggest task now is to reunite and reconcile the country. Do you think he can do that?
I wish it were true, but I can't see any sign of it. The Republican blocking actions go deep into the history of the party. They've been prominent since Gingrich in the 1990s. That's led some of the leading political commentators like Thomas Mann, Norman Ornstein of the American Enterprise Institute, very prominent commentators, led them to say that the Republican Party, this is before Trump, that the Republican Party is not a parliamentary party any longer. It's a radical insurgency which has abandoned parliamentary politics. They were thinking particularly of what had happened since Gingrich, got intensified under Trump. Now it's almost at a breaking point, as I said, since the big guns have pulled away, donors, the prime constituency on the one hand, the voting bloc on the other, still in the hands of Trump. And it's a deep problem for the Republicans that go way back.
Okay.
The Republican Party, as far back as you go, has been devoted primarily to the interests of the very rich and the business sector. The Democrats too, but less extremely. The Republicans are more extreme. Now, there was a time when there were moderate Republicans. They were very similar to Clintonite Democrats. That part of the party has almost disappeared.
So
can't find them. Now, what's left?
Biden will try to reunite and reconcile, but it will be very difficult to do it, or he won't put too much or not enough effort into it.
I'm sure he'll try. Obama tried. It was a complete failure. It'll probably be a complete failure this time because they don't want to reconcile. They don't want to cooperate. They want to get back into power. And there's a means to get back into power. follow the McConnell program, which he refined under Obama. It's been carrying forward under Trump. I see no reason to doubt that he'll go back to it, carrying most of the Republican leadership with him. They'll have, on the other hand, Trump with his own system, what he's setting up, which will be in effect doing the same thing, maybe cooperating, maybe not, but essentially trying to make the country ungovernable, which means harming people as much as possible, and then come back into power. They might do it in 2022, the way the Republicans did in 2010, 2 years after Obama came in office.
How do you see the chances of impeachment?
Pardon?
How do you see the chances of impeachment?
Not very high. And I don't know, I mean, the only thing impeachment would achieve is rendering Trump unavailable for office later. Okay, that's something, but it's not a huge issue. If it won't be Trump, it'll be somebody like him. But the issues are much deeper than that. So first of all, I don't think it's going, we'll see, but I don't think it'll go through.
So
I think
after the inauguration yesterday, you are not in a very optimistic mood.
I felt better about getting rid of a real malignancy, which could well have destroyed us. Another 4 years of Trump, just from these two major issues we've discussed, and there are others, but just from these two, might have carried us over to a tipping point, irreversible. It's quite possible.
In the book called Rebellion oder Untergang in German, which is now being published in German, you describe the erosion of democracy as the third biggest danger for the human race. Which part did Trump play in the erosion of democracy?
First of all, I shouldn't take credit for that. That's the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and the Doomsday Clock. They gave 3 reasons for abandoning minutes and going to seconds. One was the increasing threat of nuclear war. Second, increasing threat of environmental disaster. Third, the deterioration of democracy. Sounds at first like it doesn't belong with the other two, but it does, because it's the only way of dealing with the two major challenges is with a vibrant democracy in which engaged citizens will participate, deliberate, come up with programs, press to implement them. Without that, we're not going to deal with the first two problems. How did Trump contribute to it? Enormously. He basically emptied the executive branch of the government. It turned it into a personal fiefdom. There used to be, it used to be a functioning system with different voices, competent personnel, threw it all out, all abandoned. Extreme case was the inspectors general. Congress, the Republican Congress, had imposed inspectors general to monitor executive offices for corruption, malfeasance, and so on. They began to look into the swamp that Trump has created in Washington, the swamp of corruption, which is beyond belief. They began to investigate it. He fired them. Okay? No response from Congress. They were humiliated, but the Republicans, but they said, he's the maximal leader, we go along with it. The most extreme example is what we just saw. He announced that he's not going to accept the election because he won it. How can you have a more extreme undermining of democracy? Furthermore, he quite effectively brought the voting base of the Republicans along with him. Forgot the latest figure, but basically a majority have believed that the election was stolen because Trump said so. Okay. We're familiar with this. These are symptoms of fascism. They're not fascism. They're symptoms of fascism. It's reminiscent of things that were happening in the late Weimar years. Okay, it's not an exaggeration.
Okay. In the book, you call for more civil obedience, and I mean, Trump, when he said they stole our victory, his supporters marched to the Capitol, and we know what happened on January 6th. Is that the kind of civil obedience that you are calling for?
The counter?
The kind of civil obedience, disobedience, sorry?
Well, there was a coup attempt. That is undeniable. Overthrowing an elected government and replacing it by another one is a coup, which is what they attempted to do. Now, it wasn't the kind of coup that's carried out in US-run banana republics. It wasn't violent, brutal. The military didn't come in and impose another government. It's not the it's not the kind of coup we support all over the world, but it was an attempted coup. And it came ominously close. A lot of historians of fascism now are comparing it with the beer hall putsch, 1923. Was bad enough. That one was beaten back very quickly. They never penetrated the Capitol the way this one did. Well, but people laughed at that, if you remember. It wasn't a laughing problem. Okay. This was serious. You can argue how serious, but it was no joke. It's an attempted coup. Trump surely tried to instigate it. None of that is secret. It's all public. How seriously you take it is your own judgment. I think it's worth taking seriously. And the fact that it's supported by a large mass of the population, the majority of the Republican Party, almost half the population, it's pretty, and the whole, much of the Republican Party leadership. In fact, the only thing that began to push them away slightly was when the big guns who own and run the economy came in and said no, then they pulled back. But how do we know that'll happen next time?
But the Trump supporters call that civil disobedience. Is that civil disobedience what happened, or was that just a attempted coup?
It was an attempted coup, undeniably. By definition, it was an attempted coup. That's what they announced. We are attempting a coup. Okay? So yes, they attempted it. It was beaten back. Military wouldn't accept it. The military actually didn't move in. You notice they stayed in the background, but they made it very clear they were not going to accept it. In fact, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, top military command, came out with a very strong statement, which you perhaps read, calling this insurrection and sedition. Those are strong words. Incitement to insurrection and sedition carries a very heavy prison sentence. I'm sure they chose their words quite carefully. That's what they called it. You can say that
Trump obviously has the ability to manipulate and to mobilize people. So what can other activists, because you call for more activism, what can they learn from Trump? Is there anything they can learn from him?
They can learn not to, they don't even have to wait for Trump. I'm old enough to have memories of listening to Hitler's Nuremberg rallies over the radio. I didn't understand the words when I was 6 years old, but I could grasp the mood of massive support for this hideous maniac was unmistakable. Okay. And there have been others like that, not as extreme as Hitler, but we've had plenty of demagogues. They're around right now. Trump was a very effective one. So yes, he was able to do it. He was able to effectively tap poisons that run right beneath the surface of American society. They're deep. They have deep sources. They're always there. Uh, White supremacy, misogyny, xenophobia, uh, uh, fanatic extremist religion. They're all there. And he was brilliantly able to bring them to the surface. Hitler did the same thing. Once these forces are out there, they're very hard to control. Okay? How can you deal with them? It's going to be hard work. Now, there is extensive mobilization of progressive activist forces, which have had an impact. So if you look at, say, Biden's program, climate program, it's not what it ought to be, but it's well more advanced than any previous one,
Mhm.
far more advanced than Obama or anyone else. And that's because of pressure of young activists. Should say that the Democratic National Committee, which is Clintonite neoliberals, they've been trying to impede it every step of the way. They, in fact, even removed it at one point from the Democratic Party website. There's a struggle going on inside the party, but nevertheless, it was pressed by activist groups, mostly young, had some success. If this continues, the pressure, Biden might have decent program. If it's relaxed, he'll probably go back to Clintonite centrism,
But
moderate republicanism.
is there anything that progressive activists, if they want to mobilize people that they couldn't learn from Trump?
You don't try to learn from demagogues. What you learn from Trump is the ability to stand up in a roaring crowd, hold up a sign saying, I love you, follow me, while with the other hand, you're stabbing them in the back.
Mhm, mhm,
That's Trump.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
You don't want to learn that.
No, for sure not. No. Um, Despite the three problems that you are the doomsday people identified, currently most people are maybe most afraid of the corona pandemic. How dangerous do you think the corona pandemic is?
Well, I happen to be talking to you from Arizona. Arizona just won an award. It is the world champion in per capita coronavirus cases.
Mhm.
This is the richest country in the world, extraordinary advantages. I'm sitting in a well to do state, the world capital in per capita coronaviruses. I'm 92 years old. I can't get vaccinated. There is vaccination going on, but it's so incompetent that in the richest country in the world, they can't get to me, let's say.
You don't
Okay.
know yet when you'll get your vaccination?
When? I
Yeah.
have no idea. I'm on a list. Every time you call up, they say, wait till you're called.
Mhm, mhm,
Okay.
mhm, mhm.
I mean, it's not serious for me. You know, I'll make out okay. I'm privileged enough to make out. For many other people, it's not okay.
Mhm.
And this, remember, is the richest country in the world, has advantages incomparable to any other country. And in fact, if you go back a little, we can see the reasons for this. I mean, there are deep reasons. I'll keep to the more superficial ones. When Obama came in 2009, in the first days in office, he called the Presidential Scientific Advisory Council together, asked them to put together a pandemic response program. What do we do in case there's a pandemic? They worked out a program. It was implemented. It lasted for until January 2017. The day Trump came into office, his first acts were to dismantle the entire program. Okay, so nothing's prepared.
Mhm, mhm,
I
mhm.
began defunding the Center for Disease Control, continued every year, even after the pandemic started last February. The budget defunded the Center for Disease Control. There were programs of American scientists working with Chinese colleagues to try to identify coronaviruses and work on how to deal with them, and so on. He canceled them. Now, this is on top of deep institutional failures. Back in 2003, after the SARS epidemic, scientists were saying, look, here's what you have to do to stop the next one. It's clear what you had to do. Incidentally, they're saying the same things now, but somebody has to do it, not the drug companies. They're capitalist institutions. They want profit tomorrow, not prepare for something that might happen in 10 years. So they didn't do it. Capitalist logic stopped that. What about the government? Has wonderful labs, endless resources. Why don't they do it? Something called neoliberalism. Government is the problem, not the solution. Government can't do anything. You have to throw everything to private capital. So the government didn't do anything. These problems still exist. On top of that was the malevolence and incompetence of particular leadership groups. Put all this together, you get real wreckage. And it's unnecessary. There are plenty of countries that have dealt with it.
And globally, how dangerous do you think this pandemic is globally? Is it something that we will have forgotten in 2 years, or?
Well, I don't know any more than the scientists who I read, in fact, less. And what they're predicting right now is that in the United States, it's already 400,000 deaths. It'll probably go a couple 100,000 beyond. Other parts of the world, we don't know. We don't know what, take, say, Germany, Europe. Europe had the first wave pretty well controlled. If you look at the curve, by May, June, it was declining sharply. Then Europeans decided, I want my vacation. I want to go to the beach. Okay. They had their vacation. Now there's a spike. Okay. That's what happens with irresponsibility and cultural irresponsibility. It's not just the institutions that are a problem. There are also cultures, and a culture of individuality, lack of collective concern for one another, that leads to disaster. Actually, we saw it in many ways in Europe. Take the beginning of the pandemic. The epicenter for a time was northern Italy. Very serious pandemic in northern Italy. There are two rich countries north of Italy called Austria and Germany. Very rich countries. They had it pretty well under control. There's something called the European Union. Did the rich countries north of Italy move in to try to help out with the pandemic? Well, you know the answer better than I do. They didn't care. Fortunately for northern Italy, they could go across the Atlantic to the superpower that is the one internationalist country in the world, Cuba, which sent lots of doctors, and China supplied pharmaceuticals. So northern Italy got some relief, not from Germany.
But do you think that people have now understood that this global pandemic, this global problem can only be solved together? And now that Trump is not there, do you think that this could usher into a new form of international cooperation?
Well, there's a good measure of that, which you can look at. Take a look at COVAX, the international consortium that is trying to deal with, first of all, with cooperation to produce viruses, which is the best way, and also to try to deal with the distributional problems. How can you deal with the likelihood that the rich will monopolize the viruses for themselves? That's COVAX. Trump pulled out of it. Okay, he didn't want to be part of it. Other countries are still in. There's a very mixed record. The rich countries are mostly trying to get it for themselves. Take a look around the world. Actually, one of the worst is Canada, a country that prides itself on its internationalism. I think they're actually in the lead in storing up viruses for vaccines for potential use maybe years from now. The distributional problems have not been solved. Now, there is one country, China, which says they're going to do it. Says. Whether they'll do it or not, I don't know. But as far as I know, they're the one country that said we're going to supply vaccines with almost at cost, no profit. If they do it, great. I don't know whether they will or not, but I'd like to see the other countries do it.
Not very optimistic that this might lead to a new form of international cooperation, this pandemic.
It should, but whether it will or not is another question. There are forces trying to push in that direction. And one of them is maybe the main one is the Progressive International, which in Europe is based on GEM25, the transnational European organization that's working to try to salvage what's valuable in the European Union to overcome the deep flaws. They've associated with the Sanders movement in the United States as similar programs. They just had their first international meeting in Iceland, where the prime minister is a member of the directorate. They have voices from the global south. They're working around the world to do exactly what you're talking about. And the question is how effective they'll be. That depends on participation and cooperation.
Coming back to the climate change, Greta Thunberg, she managed to mobilize mostly young people around the world to demand more ambitious climate goals. What do you think about her?
Greta Thunberg?
Yeah.
Marvelous person. She's being bitterly attacked in the United States, maybe elsewhere. All kind of claims that she's being exploited, that she's reading a script, that she's just nobody, set up an alternative girl to her, blonde hair, blue eyes, be the right-wing counterpart, anything to do to undermine her. But she's kept very strong and very good. I think it's very impressive. If you haven't seen it, you should look at the opening meeting of the last Davos conference last January. The rich and powerful get together to congratulate each other on how wonderful they are. The opening session had 2 keynote speeches, which are memorable. The first one was, of course, Trump. They had to invite the Godfather, the leader of the world, and he gave his usual rambling, vulgar, self-congratulatory address. The audience is kind of squirming. They don't like him. He interferes with the image of humanism that they're trying to project. But they applauded him enthusiastically because he made it very clear he's going to keep pouring money into the hands of the rich. That's basically his message. Yes, I'm a vulgar slob. I'll wreck everything, but don't worry, I'm going to fund you. So a lot of applause. It was followed by Greta Thunberg. Short, quiet talk, factual, simple, saying, here's the situation we face. It's a dire situation, factually accurate, then turning to the audience and saying, you betrayed us, which is quite true. Polite applause, and then saying, nice girl, go home to school where you belong. We'll take care of it. I'm kind of exaggerating, but that's basically the picture. It's worth looking at. Tells you a lot about the world.
Do you think, in fact, in face of the seriousness of the climate problem, is she radical or not enough, or do you think that Extinction Rebellion is maybe the better answer to? Is it more the Greta way or the Extinction Rebellion approach?
I mean, you can question some of the tactics. They question them themselves. So, for example, the tactic of closing down the mass transportation system in protest, that's a bad tactic. You're harming the people you're trying to mobilize. So tactics have to be designed to achieve the results you want. But the basic thrust of it was very positive, I think. also the climate rebellion, the climate protests, global climate strike, very effective. Sunrise movement in the United States, young people who were agitating, educating, finally started occupying congressional offices, the offices of Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic House leader. They were supported by a few of the young congressional representatives who came in on the Sanders wave, mainly Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They were joined by Ed Markey, a senior senator from Massachusetts who's been concerned with the environment. And they managed to move the idea of a Green New Deal from being an object of ridicule off on the side to the center of the legislative agenda. That's extremely important. That's the only hope for survival, not the one they proposed, but some version of a Green New Deal is essential. And moving it from the sidelines to the center of attention is an achievement. Now, of course, Biden won't accept it, already said so. Democratic National Committee doesn't like it. They're Wall Street oriented Clintonites. They don't want this Green New Deal nonsense. But if the popular forces keep pressing it, they may get it. May not have the same name, but something like that. And a lot of this is, almost all of it is young people. I mean, they're way in the lead. Greta Thunberg's kind of a symbol.
I mean,
and they're right. We betrayed them.
Yeah. According to your analysis concerning climate change, nuclear, the danger of a nuclear war, the erosion of democracy, we are very close to doomsday. Is there still hope, or did you give up hope?
No, I never give up hope. Last January, we were, by the assessment of the analysts, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, we were 100 seconds away. I suspect this year, you'll see in a couple of days, I think January 27th, they come out with a new announcement. It'll probably, maybe they go back to 2 minutes because Trump is out. That's possible, but only if there's enough pressure on Biden and other countries. We're not alone. There's other countries to do what has to be done. In fact, about half of the pollutants that are expected to come out will be from emerging countries. We have to do something about that. It's our responsibility. It's the responsibility of the rich and powerful and privileged to do something about the poor countries. First of all, just out of a straight moral responsibility. Second, because we have a large share of the reason why they're so poor and we're so rich. We know, I don't have to go through the history, you know it. So yes, we have a duty and a responsibility to try to clean up the horrendous mess we've made of the world. And this is crucial for survival at this point. It's not being done.
Sorry?
It's not being done. Okay, but go ahead. Yeah.
You are now 92 years old, and you have been arguing with every US government since the 60s. Do you still have the energy and the power and the will to do the same with the Biden government?
Well, I started on this when I was 10 years old, and I wrote an article about the spread of fascism in Europe and how frightening it was. I wouldn't say I understood much. Not a good article, I'm sure, fourth grade newspaper. But I do remember the feeling of fear at what was happening, especially in Europe, partially in Asia. And it was very frightening from a child's point of view. I later learned that the fears were not out of place. Turns out at about the same time, we learned later, high-level American planners were planning for the post-war world. And what they were expecting was a world that would be split between a US-controlled world and a Nazi-controlled world. that was their expectation at the time when I was writing about my childish fears about the spread of fascism. It was real, and we know what happened. Came very close. If the Russians hadn't defeated Germany, could have happened. I mean, in fact, the planners changed their assessments right after Stalingrad and Kursk, when it was clear that the Russians were going to beat back the German invasion. Then they changed their assessment and plans changed, but it was awfully close. Now, we're not there now. We have different fears: nuclear weapons, environmental catastrophe, deterioration of the democratic system, pandemics, plenty of other things. There's going to be a huge immigration crisis. I mean, I happen to agree with Pope Francis that the immigration crisis is a moral crisis of the West. It's not a crisis of refugees. Europe has a horrible record on this, even worse than the United States. It's disgraceful, shameful, and it's going to become much worse. The effects of warming the planet are going to cause huge numbers of refugees. Where are they going to go? Are they going to go to sub-Saharan Africa? No. They're going to try to get to the rich countries, just like you and I would do if we were driven out of our homes. Well, these are all impending serious crises.
And do you have the power and the energy to be a vital voice in that fight still?
What's the alternative? The alternative is to say, nice knowing you, goodbye, we're done.